Okay, we're back with Envy Louis and Walk on Water, The Secrets Revealed. This time, chapter 4, which tackles what Peter was actually afraid of. What was Peter afraid of? The next key bits of information are about the fact that Peter was a fisherman. He was a man of the sea. Yet Peter was not afraid because he couldn't do what Jesus was doing on the water in a miraculous way. It's been taught all over the world that Peter was afraid because it was a bit windy and wavy on the waterline. Matthew 14:30 reads, "But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, 'Lord, save me.'" It's now time for a very good question. Would a brave fisherman actually be so afraid in the same situation? One whose entire life had been dealing with various types of windy, wavy conditions within the water? Is it not naturally assumed that Peter was an avid swimmer? Wasn't Peter one who spent almost every single day being well acquainted with throwing out nets into the sea over the side of boats? And yet, for Peter to suddenly start crying out in fear over such a trivial matter of a little winded wave? Seems a bit odd for such an experienced seaworthy character, don't you think? And then to top it off, Jesus' words were, "O you of little faith," indicating the wind and wave factor was of minor concern. Peter cried out in fear, "Lord, save me!" But what was the Lord to save him from? From swimming? Or was Jesus to save Peter from getting wet? Of course not. Peter was fear-stricken. But what was Peter afraid of? Peter was unmistakably afraid of drowning. He wouldn't have been afraid unless he didn't know how to swim. In fact, this is far from an uncommon predicament. It is a fact that anyone and everyone who doesn't know how to swim acts exactly the same way. They panic in fear of drowning. When an individual first attempts to learn to swim, a friend or instructor will usually be right there to aid the non-swimmer in learning the first few skills. As the instruction progresses, the beginner will show signs of attaining minor swimming skills all by himself. With difficulty nonetheless, he will keep himself buoyant just as long as the instructor is near. Yet, when the instructor invariably backs away, the beginner typically loses confidence and sinks. He becomes suddenly afraid, within a desperate panic, doubting his own demonstration of his own newly discovered abilities. However, when the instructor merely stretches forth his hand, just touching the fear-stricken soul, the sinking beginner suddenly starts again to stay buoyant on his own accord. It happens every time. Well, most often anyway. This type of doubt complex surfaces undisputably within almost every single beginner swimmer. A critical point is that if a person is moving around in the water, yet not appearing to be swimming in any direction, he would either be floating with some type of inflatable device wrapped around his waist, or he would be treading water, which is stomping his feet up and down in the water to stay afloat. Of course, the modern term is just called treading water. So, why didn't the translators use the word tread instead of the word walk? The following scriptures reveal just a few references to the word tread within the Old and New Testament. They all describe activities that include using one's feet or animal hooves to walk over or stomp on things, to trample one's enemies, or to make wine, or clay, or mortar. The word tread is used in the Old Testament in the book of Joshua, chapter 1, verse 3. "Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses." Job 40:12 reads, "Look upon every one that is proud, and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place." Ezekiel 34:18 reads, "But ye must tread down with your feet the residue of your pastures." And in the Old Testament, the writings of Micah 1:3 read, "For behold, the Lord cometh forth out of his place, and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth." Malachi 4:3 reads, "And ye shall tread down the wicked, for they shall be ashes under the sole of your feet in the day that I shall do this, saith the Lord of hosts." Luke 10:19 reads, "Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions." In the Old Testament, Nahum 3:14 reads, "Go into clay and tread the mortar." And Revelation 11:2 reads, "And the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months." Isaiah 63:2 reads, "And thy garment like him that treadeth in the wine vat." Isaiah 16:10 reads, "The treaders shall tread out no wine in their winepresses." How could these simple words have been so mixed up? Might they have been deliberately mistranslated, or was it an innocent error on the part of the writers and translators? However, the translators of the King James Version may not be all to blame. If in fact swimming was not an everyday occurrence back in the days of John the Baptist, then attempting to write it would have been rather difficult. It would be like trying to prove to the world in our 21st century that you saw a man flying without the use of an airplane, hot air balloon, wings, air jets, etc. Is there even a word for that? Skywalker maybe, or air treading possibly? It's plain to see how the translators might have had a difficult time with that one. In light of any misunderstanding or common philosophy that had prevailed since then, people may think that Jesus Christ could do just about anything, including walk with his feet on top of the waterline. But back then, there really wasn't a word for treading water. To them, it would be like somehow walking in the water. Now, if you think about it for a minute, is there any wonder why our common use of the word treading water has a quaint similarity to the words walking within water? However phenomenal it might seem, to imagine a person levitating on top of a water line goes way out there. It's a no-brainer to realize that such a feat would be impossible without somehow completely breaking the laws of physics. So the question remains, why would a person perform such a feat of walking on water when swimming would serve the greater, more sensible example? The act of believing that you could somehow get across such a dangerously long expanse of swimming in the darkness is tough enough. And why would Jesus attempt to do this? Was it for the sake of helping a few brothers out in the middle of a treacherous situation so they could at least get to their destination? He knew he could help them, but he also knew the struggle ahead of him. The point is that Jesus did this at a time when very few people, if anybody, could actually swim. This is one of the key elements of the time. In that area, amidst those people, no one even knew what human swimming was to even have a name for it. However, as opposed to this, who would ever think anyone, including Jesus, should perform such an incredible phenomenon such as levitating on top of a liquid body of water for such a long distance journey, and then for Jesus to have the nerve and audacity to belittle, to criticize one of his disciples for not being able to do the same? And for what purpose would either of such incredible feats be worthy of, along with belittling his followers? Would the purpose be to attempt to confuse people? And think about this. Would the love of Jesus actually ever try to belittle anyone who could not do such a simple thing with their mind as to defy the law of gravity? How absurd that would be. It would have been totally out of character for Jesus, who is a loving man of God, to do anything of the sort. And we know Jesus was no show-off, but if Jesus walked on top of the water surface and then rebuked his followers for not being able to do the same thing, then one might assume such a thing. But the truth is that what Jesus actually did was far more wonderful and beneficial for the disciples than what we have been taught all of our lives about this event. The main purpose of this work is not to disprove the Bible. The Bible reveals all truth when it is correctly translated and interpreted. 2 Peter 1:20 says, knowing this first, that no prophecy of the scripture is of any private interpretation. 2 Timothy 2:15 says, study to shew thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. That's correctly interpreting the word of truth. It should be understood first that Peter was afraid for his life within the most simplest involvement with the water, while Jesus had the courage to swim all the way out to them in the conditions of wind and wave and darkness. Peter could barely muster up enough courage to swim on his own. That's right next to the boat and right next to Jesus. He was so close to Jesus, all he had to do was reach out and touch him. A long-distance swim like what Jesus did was beyond what most people will ever dare. Who would be brave enough to attempt such a feat? Would you be brave enough? Very few people would ever try it, even with a life preserver strapped to himself. Here in the 21st century, it's rare that anyone ever swims out farther than even a couple hundred yards before finding the task far too challenging. In this case, the swimmer usually turns back to shore and is usually thankful that he made it back there before being overcome with exhaustion. The example Jesus triumphantly made was that he endured the journey through what would have been a life-consuming struggle for anyone else, and especially for that culture and at that time. On the other hand, if Jesus was able to simply walk out there on top of the waterline as a special effect, no one is going to consider believing in that sort of thing as some type of courageous struggle. A courageous man takes a challenge on faith. He who is courageous is one who pursues a goal even in the face of grave dangers. Few people today would do so much as attempt such feats in such conditions as Jesus did. Therefore, if swimming was merely what Peter attempted to do, then the rebuke of Peter having such little faith was indeed justified. Jesus confidently displayed a vibrant example. Peter, on the other hand, was rebuked for displaying a very bad example. Let's walk through a graphic scenario of what Jesus and Peter actually did. But this time, let's put a little twist into the scenario, giving a little more credit to the disciples for their honor, their fears, their integrity, and possibly their sense of humor. Firstly, we know that Jesus took a few hours to get out to the guys struggling in the boat. This is what they would have been peering out at the entire time of their rowing expedition. They wouldn't have been able to see Jesus' head bobbing up and down while he swam toward them because of the windy and wavy and darkness of the terrain. For those who are unfamiliar with how oarsmen will row a rowboat and the direction of travel they must carry out while sitting inside the vessel, the following illustrations indicate which way the oarsman would face while rowing. This would definitely be in opposition to a bunch of guys rowing in the daytime, and especially if the person was walking on top of the waterline. Now take a minute to examine the next scenario. Since the men are all facing toward the area where Jesus started from, if this was in the daytime with Jesus walking on top of the water, they might see a little speck of a person approaching them. But they wouldn't know who or even what it might be at first. But those men had good eyes if they were fishermen. An hour into Jesus' journey would make Jesus walking toward them a little more recognizable. At this point, the disciples might start joking around a bit. After a couple of hours of the journey, some of the guys in the boat might get a little worried, while at the same time, some of them would have kept their composure, realizing that, well, with Jesus Christ, just about anything is possible. The next illustration here would begin the event that everyone has all heard, but with a twist to keep some of the integrity as well as a few of the disciples' sense of humor intact. Now let's play this out with the correct scenario, which was likely to have been under a starlit night taking note that the disciples were constantly watching where they came from. At first, all they could see was darkness on their surface horizon. However, when Jesus got close enough, one of the disciples would have noticed a head bobbing around, swimming toward them in the water. Jesus would notice them commenting about his approach and would hear them saying things about their fears, but may not have heard their other comments. Therefore, the first thing he mentions to them was to not be afraid. However, Peter, he's got other things on his mind. He's obviously been testing the waters without any flotation device wrapped around himself, and he's been doing this previously on his own. There would be no doubt that the other disciples would have commented about this very fact. It should also not be surprising that Jesus may have mentioned something about Peter's attempt at swimming, which at this point would have inspired Peter to have risen to such occasion. It's also likely that Jesus would have been a bit cautious about this type of Peter's inspired ambition. Jesus would have attempted to make sure Peter was confident enough, while this was also another opportunity to be a loving supporter of the group, teaching them of the love of God and of his power and mercy. Of course, when Peter works his way out of the boat and down into the water, Jesus is right there next to him to make sure Peter wouldn't suddenly slip under the boat or something due to any of Peter's possibly lack of swimming skills. That was even over the current pressures of a windy and wavy environment. Peter at that time would have kicked his feet in the water for a while, just like anybody else, just learning to swim. All this, of course, is while Peter is still unaware or unsure of how to manipulate his hands and arms to have continued more easily to tread water at that time. And this is what would have frightened him. Help! Help! I can't swim! Well, you could if you did this and this with your feet. But not all beginner swimmers are aware of all the different things you need to do. Well, there's only two different things you need to do. Learn how to use your arms and learn how to go like this with your feet. Peter could have easily been tiring out over just a minute or two while freaking out about the splashing white-capped waves that continued to hit his face. Struggling to stay afloat as most beginner swimmers react in this situation, Peter panicked. Peter, throwing his arms upward, trying to grab the air or something, Jesus recognized Peter's lack of confidence as well as his lack of unrehearsed skill. Those who lack swimming skills are easily frightened by the possibilities of submersion. Peter obviously had a problem with swimming, or he wouldn't have become afraid. This makes much more sense than a rebuke made for Peter's inability to perform an incredible feat of levitation, now doesn't it? Now, a few interesting points about the disciples' reactions are detailed in Mark 6:49 through 52. Starting in verse 49, but when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. Of course they were troubled. They saw him in a place that they never saw him before, and thinking that it was a spirit, they all saw his head bobbing around. If they saw him standing up on the water next to the boat, do you really think they would think it's a spirit? They would see him. They would wonder, wow, this is incredible. Holy smokes. And then Peter would say, wow, I want to do that too. I want to levitate. Well, he wouldn't say levitate, but why would Jesus be standing up on the water when swimming would have been the greater example? When swimming would have been faithful. Standing on the water, there's nothing faithful about it. That's illusionary. That's trickery. It doesn't serve the purpose of helping them to understand the love of God. The disciples' reactions are detailed in Mark 6:49. But when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them, and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed. Sore amazed. That's an important point. Sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. Sore amazed, and they didn't consider the miracle of the loaves. So their heart was hardened. Sore amazed. Heart was hardened. It all fits. They were jealous. They were angry. Peter was getting all the attention. And Peter swam. And they couldn't. It's interesting to note that a few of the other guys in the boat may have had an issue with how much attention Jesus was giving to Peter, as if Jesus seemed to be avoiding the other disciples. Mark 6:52 indicates that the disciples may have considered the time of the loaves, but not the miracles of the loaves. They refer to the time Jesus fed the 5,000, but not the amazing miracles that took place in everyone's hearts throughout all the people who got food that day. There was undoubtedly groveling between those disciples, but Jesus picked those men not only because of their abilities, but also because of their hearts. Jesus was no fool. He knew the kind of men that would follow his instruction, regardless of the adversarial conditions that would be imposed upon them through his own struggles. Peter would have learned a valuable lesson of humanity within this crazy episode in his life. The other disciples would have also learned the same and would have appreciated Peter's struggle regardless of how Peter felt about it. More points regarding Mark 6:49 through 52 will be examined further in chapter 9. Now, regarding what Jesus said, if he walked on the water, a comment such as, Wherefore didst thou doubt? Implying that Peter couldn't walk on top of the water just like him, would have been an impetuously rude thing to say to Peter. It would have implied that everybody walks on water. What's wrong with you? As if people do it all the time. Such a ridiculous concept would have been completely contrary to the mission that Jesus was teaching his disciples of the hope of eternal glory. Such miraculous displays of supernatural phenomenon, like having a natural ability to levitate in order to walk on top of a liquid surface, are incomprehensible even within our age of explosive discovery. Now that's what I've got for you today for chapter 4. Let's go on to points to remember. Do you remember the point of chapter 3 where we need to understand the word up and the word down are very significant? The second point is that Peter was deathly afraid, where an avid swimmer would certainly not be afraid. A third point is Christ's words, O you of little faith, indicating the wind and wave factor was certainly not an issue. The fourth important point is that most beginner swimmers act the same fearful way that Peter did. The fifth important point is that to walk also means to tread. And the sixth most important point is that Jesus swimming way out there serves as a more sensible example and a more faithful one. Number 7 is that Jesus swam all the way out to them, yet Peter could barely tread water. Number 8 is that Christ's rebuke was justified, but only if Peter could barely muster up enough courage, faith, or belief to swim on his own. And number 9 is that miraculous or phenomenal displays of walking on water are incomprehensible even within the 21st century. And until next time, please stay tuned make sure you give this video a like and make sure you're subscribed so that you can get notification of the next video, which is chapter 5 of Walk on Water, The Secrets Revealed. Until then, be good.